Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most crimson podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And with us today, we always have a guest. With us today, though, is TreyLikesBands.
Woo! Hey, guys. Glad to be back here.
It's been a while since you've been here.
Yeah, since the Beatles.
Yeah, and that was the one that really took us off to doing guests.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, since then, we've had a guest on at least once every podcast, apart from the recaps, obviously.
Damn. That's sick,
Yeah.
though.
So
Yeah.
thank you. And thank you for coming back.
Thank you, Trey.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me yet again.
Yeah. And what do we have you for? We are going to be doing a worst to best on one of the most influential progressive rock bands of all time, King Crimson.
Woo!
And I am very excited to do this one because I feel like King Crimson, they're personally one of my favorite progressive rock bands, and they have plenty of great albums under their name, and they have a lengthy enough discography, so there's that, and they're pretty influential as well, so there's a lot to take in with their music and how it how it has started a lot of things. Like, it's basically they're basically pioneers of many things, especially progressive rock. Like given what time frame they came from as well. T's insane.
Facts, bro.
And with that in mind, we're going to be doing 13 albums. We're going to be including all the 13 normal studio King Crimson albums, no live albums, no compilations or anything of that sort. Just normal studio albums that feel mainline in the band's discography. And I think without wasting any more time, we'll just do it. And at the unlucky number 13 spot, what I think is King Crimson's worst album is Beat.
I went with The Construction of Light.
Sorry, my mic was muted. I also went with Construction of Light.
I'm alone here,
We'll
I
do the normal
see.
order then.
Yeah. Beat is the second album in the 3 of a Perfect Pair trilogy, and an album that has grown on me a little bit since I last heard it. But regardless, I don't think it's one of the band's major highlights. Much like Discipline, King Crimson is dabbling in a lot of the new wave sounds that were popular at the time when compared to a lot of the material that's on that album, most of the tracks on Beat just pale in comparison with it. Given it does have some different concepts and fundamentals that are pretty distinct in that whole trilogy, so I wouldn't say it's a direct, lazy attempt to recreate an album, but rather, just try something new, but with a similar sound palette. I think that the production is fine for the most part. I think it has some fine moments. It genuinely has some great tracks and good instrumentation, but sometimes it just feels like a bit of a mess, and it ends up getting mind-numbingly repetitive. Some tracks even sound really messy and ugly, like Neurotica and The Howler, the former of which probably being my least favourite King Crimson song, in all honesty. Plus, there's songs on here, that just straight up sound like Talking Heads songs, so that's something, and you cannot convince me otherwise. And it's a bit more of an accessible record in King Crimson's discography, but in my opinion, doing an accessible sound isn't a bad thing, but in my opinion, it doesn't really lend well to this, monotonous new wave setting that King Crimson kind of caught themselves in the 80s. And
Yeah, I went with The Construction of Light. And this album for me is just so overwhelming and derivative of just so many things, either past endeavors in their previous record and just a lot of, progressive metal that was around at the time, that it's really hard for me to put this anywhere other than last place. In fact, it's pretty much the only King Crimson album that I don't genuinely like. The instrumentation just feels far too synthetic and lifeless on a lot of these tracks. None of the guitar work, vocal work, drumming work is in any way hard hitting and just comes off a bit as a bit limp at times. There are some good moments, and I think the band's sound and what they're going for with this more industrial approach definitely work. But there's also a lot of moments where it just feels completely lifeless and repetitive and just not enjoyable, really.
Yeah, no, all of those points, like, I totally agree with. I went with Construction of Light as well. It's very monotonous throughout. It doesn't have much of anything different throughout its track list. It's all pretty much one note. There are a couple highlights here and there, obviously. First track is pretty good. There's just some other little moments in there that kind of get me. But, like, most of this thing is really boring. It's lifeless. And it's an industrial route that King Crimson went on that I don't think they should have. Because, like, it just shows them trying to pander to some era, even though they've been ahead of their time for, like, their entire existence up until this point. So, yeah, Construction of Light is my least favorite King Crimson album.
Yeah, get behind that. My favorite tracks from Beat were Neil and Jack and Me, Heartbeat, and Two Hands. My least favorite tracks were Neurotica and The Howler.
My favorite tracks on the Construction of Light were title track and Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 4. My least favorite track was Prozac Blues.
Well, my favorite track was Prozac Blues and The Construction of Light, and my least favorite's definitely probably like something like Heaven and Earth. Yeah.
All right. Moving on to our number 12 picks, I chose Three of a Perfect Pair.
I chose Beat.
Ooh.
Damn, nostalgia! I chose Beat too. We winning today.
Wow, quit stealing his rankings, damn.
Can't help it.
Just want to be like Trey.
So
I want to
who's
be like
stealing from who,
nostalgia,
then?
so it's gonna be like a cascading effect.
So who's stealing
Just
from who, then?
DM me the rest of your picks so I can match them.
Okay, hold on.
Alright, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I chose Three of a Perfect Pair, and I don't have a whole lot to say about this album as well, because pretty much I could say the same things about this album that I could say for Beat. You know, it's the final installment in in the band's new wave trilogy, but it's a moment that still lacks. It's not a bad album by any means. Much like Beat, it has grown on me a little bit, and there are definitely aspects of this album that I can enjoy, like some of the more playful and colorful atmospheres and the catchy moments too are really interesting. But besides that, a lot of the tracks are just pretty messy, kind of tedious, just very derivative. I could pretty much say the same things that I said about Beat in regards to this, so I won't really go on any longer because, I don't know, it just feels so insignificant in the band's entire discography. But I do feel like it has more highs than Beat.
Well, speaking of Beat, I obviously went with Beat. And aesthetically, this album is, obviously very similar to Discipline, its predecessor. But everything that Discipline did so well, and I'll move on to that at some point in this ranking, I think Beat just does significantly more sloppily and less effectively. It's hard to call any King Crimson album sloppy, but Beat is probably the closest the band ever gets to that. It does have, a lot of good tracks and a lot of good moments, and is overall still an enjoyable project. But there's just so many tracks on this thing that seem just either very undercooked and directionless, or just a little too overcooked and, hard to follow. Especially when compared to Discipline, which was such an effective album in what it did. I think Beat just kind of seems a little devoid of any passion and devoid of any new ideas. And, obviously I did rank it above Three of a Perfect Pair, so obviously I do think it's the worst when it comes to that new wave trilogy that the band went on in the 80s. It's definitely the weakest and the least memorable overall, in my opinion.
King Crimson New Age album? When?
I mean, when we talk about Beat, which is also my pick for my 12th pick, it has some new age elements to it. Tracks like Neurotica, I think, or something like Two Hands or The Howler. Two Hands could end up on some Lionel Richie album if I care. But even though I really like that song, but what comes down to Beat is that everything Nostalgia said, it's monotonous, it's the least interesting out of this trilogy, and there's really no memorable aspects to it except from a couple of tracks, and it really comes down to really bad song structure, poor song structure, and just overall just weak ideas all around. I feel like they were already falling off what like falling off like a creative streak that they always had, you know? So like yeah, beat is just something that exists and you just have to look at it.
Yeah.
Poor beat. Alright, my favorite tracks from Three of a Perfect Pair are the title track, Model Man, Nuagas, I think that's how you pronounce that, and Industry. My least favorite tracks were Larks' Tongues in Aspect 3, Dig Me, and No Warning.
My favorite tracks on beat were Neil and Jack and Me, Heartbeat, and Neurotica. My least favorite track was Two Hands.
Oh, damn. My favorite tracks on beat were Two Hands, Neil and Jack and Me, Heartbeat, and my least favorite was The Howler.
Alright, moving on to our number 11 picks, I chose The Construction of Light.
I chose The Power to Believe.
Oh my god.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. My 11th pick is The Power to Believe as well.
Oh my god.
Oh boy.
Jesus Christ, you're practically the same person. No way.
At this point, yeah.
God. Oh god. Anyways, The Construction of Light. Honestly, I don't mind this album. I actually think it's a pretty decent later album for King Crimson. But once again, it isn't as remarkable as a lot of the band's absolute best albums. You know, this time around, the band like shake up their progressive rock formula that they're known for with a more like industrial inspired sound, much like on Thrak. And you know, it is a cool idea in concept, but ultimately, a lot of the material on this album just isn't very interesting, bar a couple of tracks. You know, the tracks that I did like, however, I thought were incredible, like the fourth installment in Larks' Tongues in Aspic, which, you know, is possibly one of the heaviest songs in the album. And, you know, the other track is the final Heaven and Earth, you know, Project X track, which I honestly think is gorgeous, especially with the passage towards the end. You know, the rest of the album is just plagued with a lot of dreary, monotonous, and boring songs that don't really have much about them that makes them stand out. These progressions, you know, they're pretty average, and, you know, it's a shame because some of the production choices, I feel like it would have went a long way if accompanied by interesting progressions and passages. They just, I don't know, they just seem tired to me at this stage. You know, there's not much I could say besides that. It has its highs, but ultimately it just comes off quite dull.
Yeah, I went with their most recent album, although it's hard to even call it recent at this point, The Power to Believe. And I do think this album is consistently engaging and enjoyable, but there's just nothing here that would make me gravitate towards this project over, you know, a lot of other King Crimson projects that I've ranked above it. Even when it comes to the mid-90s to early 2000s era of King Crimson, I would still personally choose Thrak over this. But when you look at the project, there's not that much wrong with it. You know, everything it attempts, it does to varying degrees pretty well, but it just isn't a standout in the band's discography. And if you look at any of these tracks individually, none of them are standout tracks in the band's discography. It's just, for lack of a better word, a very solid but just unmemorable album overall.
Yeah, nostalgia, I definitely agree with you on all these points yet again. When talking about, like, this era of King Crimson, I get kind of sad because for a band that is one of my favorites of all time, like, not even just with prog, just with, like, any music, there's obviously a dropping off point for a lot of prog bands at some point. Like, the Moody Blues went into some friggin', I don't even know, disco stuff in, like, the 90s, 2 decades after it was, like, considered cool. And, I mean, at least King Crimson weren't late to the party when it comes to that stuff. You know, industrial rock was pretty high in popularity when this came out. So it feels like they were trying to cash in on something, but yet again, The Power to Believe is a decent album overall. It's got some pretty harrowing tracks all around and, like, some lulls, obviously, but that comes with anything. Yeah, The Power to Believe is another one of those albums that, like, you hardly, like, come back to it, but you can still respect it for existing.
Alright, my favourite tracks from The Construction of Light are Heaven and Earth Project X and Larks' Tongues in Aspic Part 4. My least favourite tracks are Fractured and the title track.
My favorite tracks on The Power to Believe were Level 5, The Power to Believe Part 2, Dangerous Curves. My least favorite track was The Power to Believe Part 3.
Okay, well, at least we don't have a different like favorites and least favorite tracks this time. Nostalgia. My favorite tracks from The Power to Believe are Eyes Wide Open, Level 5, and Electric. My least favorite is Dangerous Curves.
All right. Moving on to our number 10 picks, I chose Thrack.
I chose Three of a Perfect Pair.
All right, we're deviating now.
Oh my! Oh, finally.
I chose Thrack as well.
All right, I'll go last.
Hey, finally. For a second there, I actually thought you were going to whip out another.
Yeah, because there was a bit of silence.
Yeah, and I just preempting were like, oh no, not again. But then as soon as you said deviation, I was like, oh, finally.
Yeah, true.
Okay, so yeah, I chose Thrack, and much like Discipline, this album came after a hiatus, this time after 9 years, and once again, it saw the band try to adapt to what was around them in a new era, and given that it was the 90s, you can hear influences from a lot of heavier music and industrial music, and I think that King Crimson adapt to it well. It still feels like King Crimson. It still has that progressive flair while also being a pretty heavy record. Probably the heaviest record in King Crimson's catalogue, and honestly, I really like it. I like the heavier guitar tones, the industrial flair on the other bits of instrumentation is really cool. There's some really great standout tracks in the track list, and as a whole, it is a good album experience, but it isn't without its flaws, which to me mainly is down to a consistency issue, as some of the tracks, particularly on the second half of the album, are just quite uninteresting, pretty dull, pretty tedious. Most of the highlights that I liked were at the first half of the album, and as a whole, this album just isn't like that consistently interesting to be 15 tracks at 56 minutes. But it's a pretty decent album in the late era of King Crimson, and this is probably the point in my list where I actually like the albums, so we're in the green. And yeah.
Very nice. Well,
Yes.
we're here with Thrack from 1995, and it's King Crimson turning to that industrial sound, and it actually turns out pretty decent here. It's pretty cool. There are a lot of standout tracks here that like really show the ferocity of what they were going for, and I think this being like their first trek into this heavier sound, it's a lot more refreshing. Their ideas are a lot more fleshed out, and overall it's a really, really like cohesive and consistent album all around. It doesn't really, there's obviously those like lulls in between, but there isn't like a side A, side B type, like one is better than the other type thing. I think they're both really equal in what they were trying to go for, and I think the vibe around here is actually really cool as well. Like this gritty vibe, and like the production's very in your face. I like it a lot. Yeah, I really like Thrack. I respect it.
I went with Three of a Perfect Pair, and it's the third album in the band's new wave trilogy, and quality-wise, for me, it's kind of stuck in between Discipline and Beat. It's nowhere near as exciting or fleshed out or memorable as Discipline, but on the flip side, it's definitely nowhere near as half-baked and sloppy as Beat. And especially the first few tracks are fantastic and are genuinely some of the best tracks from this era of King Crimson. But the album heavily slumps for me in the middle, I think. Up until the final track, there's just a lot of very meandering and uninteresting and just uneventful tracks. Particularly the track Industry, which is just so pointless and just monotonous that it's hard to even follow at times. And these tracks definitely ruin the momentum of the album. But there is definitely a pick me up with Lark's Tongue and Apspic Part 3 at the end, which I think if any track they name, that is just gonna be good no matter what. And this one's no exception. And overall, this is a good project with some really high highs, but also some very uneventful and uninteresting lows.
Fair. My favourite tracks from Thrack are Vroom, Dinosaur, and Walking on Air. My least favourite track was Vroom Vroom Coda.
My favorite tracks on Thrack are Dinosaur, Sex, Sleep, Eat, Drink, Dream, Vroom, And then my least favorite track is Ba-Boom.
My favorite tracks on Tree of a Perfect Pair were Three of a Perfect Pair, Model Man, Sleepless, Lox's Tongue and Aspic Part 3, and my least favorite track was Industry.
Alright, moving on to our number 9 picks, I chose The Power to Believe.
I chose Thrak.
I chose Three of a Perfect Pair.
Finally,
we
some diversity!
I think we have the same 5 at the bottom, just in different orders.
Definitely.
Yeah, we do.
There's no surprise, I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think this was going to be a controversial episode anyway, so... So yeah, with that in mind, I chose The Power to Believe, the latest and more than likely the final album in the King Crimson discography. And it's probably my favourite from their post-New Wave era. I think it's a pretty good album. And as a whole, it's a pretty unique album in the band's catalogue and in general, in my opinion. And overall, I think it's pretty good. You know, this album saw the band take a lot of influence from... obviously still from industrial music and the more progressive metal scene, but also influences from electronics and to some degree IDM, and they fuse these elements together in the heavier side of their more industrial work, and it's honestly not too bad. It makes for some really interesting moments, and it's, in general, you know, a pretty unique album, like I said. I like how heavy this album is. I enjoy how these IDM drum patterns and these ambient soundscapes are implemented in some of these tracks themselves. There's some interesting standouts throughout its runtime, but it does have some moments that aren't all that interesting. I like a lot of the compositions and the riffs throughout this album. Instrumentally, a lot of this is pretty good sounding. And I find myself enjoying a lot of the more abrasive mixes on the project, and I just... I found this funny, but like... King Crimson straight up made a fucking nu metal song on this album in The Power to Believe Part 3, and honestly, it goes hard. I think that track is fucking brilliant, and I have no shame in saying that.
No, that track goes so hard.
It literally does. It's so good. And as a whole, I think this album is really good. Obviously, it's not one of King Crimson's more standout albums, hence why it's this low on the list. But I like it. I think The Power to Believe is good. I think it's a good album as a whole.
Yeah, I went with Thrak, and you know the band has definitely reimagined themselves a few times throughout their career, but with this album in the mid-90s, they kind of embraced a more prog metal and industrial style, which as a whole is definitely my least favorite era of King Crimson, and I know that a lot of people would tend to agree with me. But this era of King Crimson is definitely not without its moments, and these quote-unquote moments are almost exclusively on Thrak for me personally. I don't think it's particularly hard-hitting or unique in the grand scheme of things, but it's certainly still an enjoyable project, and I think that what the group come through with on this album, while not always very consistent, is still overall pretty well-rounded. I think instrumentally it's definitely engaging, it definitely does the job, and even if it's, you know, not the most groundbreaking thing they've ever done, it is a different album, especially for its time. It was a change of pace, and you know, I wish they hadn't, you know, milked this style as much as they have, but Thrak is still an enjoyable album, and I still enjoy it for what it is.
Nice. Well, I chose Three of a Perfect Pair for my pick here, and it's actually like, considering their trilogy in the 80s is kind of like seen as this weird detour they went off in, and like this dead end that didn't really go anywhere. I still think that Three of a Perfect Pair is a great like third addition to it. Coming right after Beat, I don't think anything could be worse when it comes to King Crimson doing this new wave stuff. So Three of a Perfect Pair was a really good follow-up. It's pretty consistent all around, except the second side of the record is a bit slow, a bit dreary. It kind of reminds me of some stuff on Beat, the really slow parts, but with Three of a Perfect Pair, I feel like they're back in the swing of things with what they did on Discipline. Like, I feel like they had sort of an awakening on Beat where it was like, you know what, let's make interesting music again. And yeah.
Alright, my favourite tracks from The Power to Believe are The Power to Believe Parts 1 to 4, Eyes Wide Open, and Electric. My least favourite track is Dangerous Curves.
My favourite tracks on Thrak were Dinosaur, Walking on Air, one time, and Vroom Vroom, my least favorite track was Ba-Boom.
My favorite tracks on Three of a Perfect Pair are Three of a Perfect Pair, Model Man, and New Ages, and my least favorite track is definitely Industry. I think that's like the worst King Crimson song.
I like that song.
Yeah, no, I don't like it.
It's so boring.
Originally, I had it as my least favorite on that album, but it has grown on me a little bit.
Fucking industrial beats to sleep to.
Isn't it just like...
Yeah.
Got
That's it.
I guess.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, well, opinions. And speaking
Like
of
what
opinions,
you like.
Exactly. And speaking of opinions, mine are we on number 9 or 8?
We're on number 8.
8, yeah.
Okay. For my number 8 pick, I chose Starless in Bible Black.
It's worth mentioning this is where the rankings get significantly harder, because I really enjoy a lot of these albums. My number...
Yeah.
Wait, 8? Yeah, my number 8 pick is also Starless in Bible Black.
We triplets. My number 8 is Starless in Bible Black as well.
Hey, let's go. Yeah, Starless in Bible Black is kind of in a weird position in the band's discography, and that's mostly due to the fact that it's sandwiched in between some of the band's most loved record in Larxus and Red. It fails to live up to those standards, obviously, and it is a flawed album, but as a whole, I think it's a pretty good album that has some merit to it. You know, this album definitely seems to pick up from where they left off with some of their previous work, but they work back their jazz-inspired roots to the sound and the structure of this album. You know, as to me, it seems like a mesh between some of the more avant-garde song structures they explored on the album that preceded this, and the more improv side of jazz instrumentation, and I really like this side of King Crimson when they execute it well. Of course, on a technical level, you can't really fuck with much on a King Crimson record. I love Robert Fripp's guitar work on this album. I think the compositions are cool. I like the lyrics on tracks like Lament and The Night Watch. And there are some brilliant sounds, like standout tracks, particularly in the first 5 tracks. But I feel like where the issue lies in this album is in the final few tracks, as these tracks in particular, while performed and composed well, meander way too much for my liking, and I just don't really enjoy listening to them. And you know, John Wetton is not one of my favorite vocalists that King Crimson ever had, and you know, there are just moments on this album where he's just not doing me any favors, you know? And that's it, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, Larxus Tongue and Aspic was obviously a hard album to follow, and Starless just it definitely displays a great sense of technical prowess, but you know, it's not, as an album, as a listening experience, it's not very memorable. A lot of the tracks just are far too free flowing and just meandering, and it's really hard to grasp onto anything you hear. You know, I do appreciate the very off-kilter and bizarre compositions, and a lot of them are genuinely very enjoyable, but it's quite impossible for me to rank this above, you know, any of their more complete and more well-rounded albums, because I really just feel like this album isn't that well-rounded. It's a bit directionless. It's not bad, it's just a bit directionless.
Yeah, I totally get the directionless argument for this album. And I think how I would put it, I wouldn't call it directionless for me. I'd call it just plain old abstract. From up until this point in their catalog, there haven't been many albums filled with these free improv tracks, like full tracks with a bunch of free improv in it. And I think it's because I haven't delved into that genre too much that I find myself looking at this as good free improv. I don't know if it's is considered good or bad improv, but I really enjoyed it overall. Not to say that the whole thing is improv, some are obviously planned out tracks, but yeah, the first half of this record is really solid, some of the best stuff. And honestly, there's not really, the second half is only 2 tracks is what I mean, looking at side A and side B. And those 2 tracks are pretty interesting stuff. Although I don't listen to Starless and Bible Black, the title track, that much, it's the one I come back to a lot. And I I don't know. It's just, this record's very cryptic. And it's the most cryptic record in their catalog, and I respect it heavily for that.
I respect it too. Alright, my favourite tracks from Starless and Bible Black are Lament, The Night Watch, Trio, Will Let You Know, and The Great Deceiver. My least favourite tracks are The Mincer, Fracture, and Starless and Bible Black.
My favourite tracks on Starless and Bible Black were The Great Deceiver, Will Let You Know, and The Night Watch. My least favourite track was The Mincer.
Yeah, my favorite tracks were Trio. Oh, I love Trio. It's so pretty. Trio, The Great Deceiver, and The Night Watch. My least favorite is The Mincer.
Alright, we're going to kick off the top half of our list now at the number 7 spot. And I chose Lizard.
I also chose Lizard.
Okay.
Oh,
Actually, wait, I don't know why I'm freaking out so much. That's literally, like, not too far off from me. What am I saying? My number 7 spot is Discipline.
we're going to have another Paramore situation.
Yeah.
Remember that, dude.
Yeah.
Alright, so Lizard. King Crimson's third album is, another really great prog endeavour from the band that saw them kind of stick to their guns, and while I think that it isn't a perfect album, it's still really solid in my opinion. Production-wise, once again, I think it's very good. Everything sounds really good, well crafted, and tightly performed. I like how the album tries to take the band's sound into a more avant-garde side of the jazz sphere, and I like tracks like Indoor Games and Happy Family have some sort of swagger to them, and it has some great standouts that have their own unique traits to them. Best example is literally the 23-minute long title track, which is just absolutely fantastic. I wouldn't say there's a bad or even a weak song on this album in my opinion. I don't listen to Lizard all that often, but whenever I put it on, I have fun. Yeah, I think it's another record from the band that goes a little underrated. But the main criticism I have for Lizard is in the vocals. I'm not a fan of Gordon Haskell's vocals in particular. He kind of kills the mood for some of these tracks with how flat and somewhat unenthused he comes off as. Besides that, I like this album as a whole. I think it's a really good endeavour from King Crimson, and it has definitely got some of their most standout tracks in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. The title track alone is almost like enough to make this a good album and put it over the edge. And that being said, the other tracks also, definitely don't do this album a disservice, but the title track in particular is just 23 minutes of pure genius. It's one of the best tracks in the band's whole catalogue. And while nothing else on this project really lives up to it, everything else is still, varying degrees of good. I do definitely appreciate the more avant-garde approach the band took after what was a somewhat predictable direction with their sophomore. It definitely was really indicative of their debut. This album definitely feels like a breath of fresh air for the band. And, again, Lizard exists. That track is incredible. Everything else is fine, but this is really the reason I'm ever going to listen to this album. It's just this track.
Very nice. Yeah. So my 7th pick is Discipline, and in my opinion, and I think a lot of people will agree with me here saying that, like, this is the best in that trilogy that they did in the 80s. Like, this thing, it's, I think, in my ranking, going from Starless and Bible Black to Discipline, that's a steep climb, because Discipline is, like, super solid. Like, you've got these... they're using a fretless bass on this whole thing, which really, like, gives this sort of edge as if it's, like, more electronic. It's more edgy. It's also more 80s sounding, which is pretty cool. And it's super complex and, like, technical all throughout these, like, really, like, technical bass lines all around, and, like, the guitar beats and just these uncommon time signatures. It's very playful as well, this record. The vocalist for this one, Adrian Belew, I think fits the vibe of it so well. And I think with the whole trilogy, I think he does a really great job on vocals when he is singing. But I think the highlights here are some of King Crimson's most out there stuff. And this album is just, it's hard to really put to words. And, like, it's going to be hard for me to talk about albums later on if I'm having a hard time just talking about one at my 7th spot. So we'll see what happens.
All right. My favorite tracks from Lizard are Lizard, Circus, and Lady of the Dancing Water. My least favorite track is Indoor Games.
My favorite tracks were Circus and Lizard, and my least favorite track was Lady of the Dancing Water.
Oh, you can't do that to me. That song is so pretty.
I'm sorry, sir.
So, for Discipline, my favorite tracks are Mate Kudasai, Frame by Frame, and Elephant Talk. My least favorite is Thela Hun Jinjit.
Okay, moving on to our number 6 picks. Is it 6?
Yeah.
It's 6. I chose In the Wake of Poseidon.
I chose Island.
Okay. Sorry. I hate hearing these albums so low because these albums, like, up until, like from 6 on for me, all of these albums are, like, super equal. And, like, some are obviously better, obviously, but, like, all of these, it's going to have a tough time ranking.
Yeah.
For my
It's
number
hard
6,
until
though,
you realize it's King Crimson we're talking about.
Right.
Like, for real,
So
like,
amazing.
the albums from this spot on for me are a 9 and above.
Right. But my number 6 spot is Lizard.
All right. Yeah, I chose In the Wake of Poseidon, and it's a really tough challenge to follow up an album like In the Court of the Crimson King. And while I think that In the Wake of Poseidon does try play it a little too safe, it's so underrated that it hurts. The band, they do play it safe by trying to make another In the Court of the Crimson King, and you can tell that's the case by the way the tracks are structured, what they go over thematically, and how they sound. Like, songs including Picture of a City and Cadence and Cascades definitely, like, mirror 21st Century Schizoid Man and I Talk to the Wind, but I'm not complaining. I think those tracks sound amazing either way, and the stuff on In the Wake of Poseidon is just as great when compared to them, honestly. I think that this album is incredibly consistent. I pretty much love every song on here for its instrumentation, compositions, and performances. I think the album has many highlights, which I will get to, of course, but I will mention once again the title track, and honest God, I think it's one of their best songs, and while it isn't a masterpiece by any means, I think that it should be rated a little bit more highly by people, because there is definitely quality to be found on here. I feel like comparing it a little too much is unfair. In the Wake of Poseidon is a stellar album that I think is high caliber on its own, and, it's another stellar album from King Crimson.
Ooh! Spicy!
Let's go.
On a surface level, Island isn't a complete deviation from what King Crimson have done up to that point, but the very orchestral sound that the band put together is really something that's very unique in their discography, and is definitely a standout, like, off of that fact alone. But the music itself is just, it has some of the most gorgeous and beautiful moments in the band's entire discography, and especially the first few tracks are just among the band's best. I think there are some moments like Song of the Gulls, which for me personally just don't do a whole lot, but this album, it's I really have to grasp at straws to come up with stuff to complain. I think the ranking is based solely off the fact that I just think the band have done more timeless and just incredible albums.
Oh, that Prelude Song of the Gulls shade kind of hurt me. So, Lizard, what a delicious album. And I'm not saying that because I eat lizards. I don't eat lizards. But if I were to eat a King Crimson album, I think this would have the most flavor.
Jesus,
actually, no. What am I saying?
Fallout New Vegas.
Red. No, I'd eat Red.
No, I would eat all of them, like, in one bite.
I would eat In the Court of the Crimson King. What do you mean?
I would definitely not eat the Construction of Light.
Sorry.
Putting that out
Honestly,
there.
Probably tastes like fucking
Definitely
plastic.
very bitter.
Probably tastes like fucking plastic.
Yeah, for real.
Like adhesive or something.
Yeah. But Lizard, it's so high caliber in the fact that they bring in these avant-garde jazz moments throughout the entire thing. That title track Lizard is, like, I think one of their top songs. It's in their top 10. It might be in their top 5. It's just any prog song. I've heard that mostly any prog song over 20 minutes is, like, amazing. I have yet to hear one that's like bad, but I'm welcoming any suggestions with that. But yeah, the title track is just so, it's so visceral. It makes you feel anxious too, and it's like very cryptic all around. And the first half of the album, what makes this so low for me is the 2 tracks, Indoor Games and Happy Family. They don't fit for me. Like, their song structures aren't memorable at all. I don't remember a single thing about the lyrics or like how they sound. Just run-of-the-mill psychedelic, like, slight prog from the 70s on those tracks. And I don't really know why they're there. Like, if those 2 tracks weren't there, this would be way higher in the rankings for me. But yeah, regardless of those 2 tracks, Circus is super solid and some of the best like jazz-infused prog I've ever heard.
Nice. My favorite tracks from In the Wake of Poseidon are Cadence Cascade, In the Wake of Poseidon, and Pictures of a City. My least favorite track is The Devil's Triangle.
My favorite tracks on Island were Formenentra Lady. I don't know how to fuck say that. Sailor's Tale. My least favorite track was Prelude, Song of the Ghost. I'm sorry, Trey.
That's okay. That's okay. So for Lizard, my favorite tracks are Lizard, obviously, Circus, and Lady of the Dancing Water. My least favorite is Happy Family.
Okay. Alright, we're moving on to our number 5. We're in the top 5. Woo!
Here we go.
Round of applause for us all.
Yes.
Alright, excellent.
Alright.
Right. Number 5. I chose Islands.
I chose In the Wake of Poseidon.
Why am I getting so torn up about these rankings? All these albums are just so good. I hate to put them just this low. But then again, my number 5 is Lark's Tongues and Aspic.
Oh.
Whoa.
Interesting.
I can't be mad about that. It's in the top 5, you know.
I'm not getting offended by anything here.
Yeah.
Me neither. Yeah, Islands. I think this is another underrated album. Like, you don't understand, man. This is amazing. You know, King Crimson essentially make an album that centers more around the subdued minimal jazz aesthetics rather than the grand and explosive sounds of their previous LPs, and I'm here for it. This is King Crimson's most subdued record. The less grand, more psychedelic and hypnotic nature is a really cool spin on the band's formula, and we get some damn fine material out of it. Of course, it isn't without its explosive moments, which are extremely gratifying, but like the more subdued stuff just works so well, in my opinion. I suppose what draws me to this album is the fact that it's one of the most unique sounding in the band's discography, and to me it's just so different from much of King Crimson's work. This meditative and subdued sound works so well for the band, in my opinion, as a lot of the avant-garde song structures we saw in Lizards, and the really interesting dynamic between the chaos and the tranquility makes for some of the best moments in King Crimson's discography. Like, the title track is easily one of my favourite King Crimson songs, period. I love the production on this album, the performances are great, the bass grooves in particular caught my attention for this album, and some of the band's most beautiful songs are on this album. You know, this is the vibe of King Crimson. You know, the choice to minimize the grander scale of the previous albums was a smart move, in my opinion. Out of all that, they created an album that just sounds so hypnotic and psychedelic. The arrangements and progressions are so engaging and fantastic, and, you know, all in all, this is just another stellar album from King Crimson.
I went with their sophomore album, In the Wake of Poseidon, and honestly, the fact that this album is a bit derivative of their debut is its biggest flaw, and even then, I don't think it's anywhere near derivative enough to, you know, really call it a flaw. It doesn't stop me from enjoying this album, and considering, you know, how incredibly influential and ambitious the album they released only the previous year was, it's really not a surprise that only a year later they would do something that is, you know, somewhat playing it safe and playing, you know, the cards that they already know they're good at. And what this album does is it does really well. I think it kind of feels like In a Court of the Crimson King's more mellow and more subtle sister, but it also has its bombastic moments. However, I do think the more mellow and more understated moments are some of my favorites on this project and in the band's discography. Tracks like Pictures of a City, like that's one of my favorite King Crimson tracks ever. It's just completely gorgeous. I love how tight the instrumentation is throughout. A lot of what I loved about In the Court of the Crimson King is still present here. Obviously, it's not as good as their debut, but really that's not saying a lot. There's not many albums that are as good as In the Court of the Crimson King, and I think this album kind of gets looked over unfairly because, you know, of the similarities. But I think the only real gripe I have is that the track The Devil's Triangle drags on way more than it should, and it does kind of disrupt the whole pace of the album. But overall, this is an incredible project, and I think it should be treated with a bit more respect.
I agree, and I also agree about The Devil's Triangle.
Yeah,
I can't wait to defend that song because I got a whole thing about it. But yeah. So my fifth pick is Lark's Tongues and Aspic. Now that might be a little low on other people's. Might be a little higher on other people's lists, and here's my thing with it. You've got those first 4 tracks that are just absolutely, they smack you in the face. I think they are some of the best material that King Crimson has ever done. Like, imagine, like, what album came out before this? I think it was, like, yeah, Islands. Imagine listening to Islands and then going like, oh, they just released a new album. Let's go buy it and put it on the record player. And then you hear the first track, just the bum, 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 on the violin, and then it just explodes. And I do not know how I would react in that time, because I would be super scared. This album is like scary. It's hypnotic. it's dissonant. It's like 1973. Like, I know it's a cliche to be like, oh, this was released in 1973. What the fuck? But genuinely, like, they're so ahead of their time. And, like, this record just proves that. Now, the reason it's this low for me is just, like, I just like the other ones more. I just connect with those more. But, yeah. Lark's Tongues and Aspic, amazing album.
Hard agree.
Yep.
My favourite tracks from Islands are Islands, The Letters, Ladies on the Road, and Prelude. My least favourite track was Formentera Lady.
My favourite tracks on In the Wake of Poseidon were Pictures of a City, Cadence, and Cascade, and In the Wake of Poseidon, my least favourite track was The Devil's Triangle.
My favourite tracks on Lark's Tongues and Aspic are Book of Saturday, Easy Money, Exiles, Lark's Tongues and Aspic Part 1, and my least favourite is The Talking Drum.
Okay, moving on to our number 4 picks. I chose Discipline.
I also chose Discipline.
Wow. I chose In the Wake of Poseidon.
Alright.
Based.
Now, at this point in the band's life cycle, they took a 7-year hiatus after Red, and they came back into a new decade that had a new prevailing sound in a lot of the new wave era. Some of the most creative bands at the time came from the early new wave scene, and I feel like they saw this and thought, yeah, we can do the same thing, but make it even better. The latter I'm not even sure of, because there's just a lot to stand up to in the new wave era, particularly a lot of Talking Heads records. But they sure as hell made a fantastic album in Discipline. I'm not sure if, like, this is just me, but you can definitely hear influence from Talking Heads, obviously. Like, in a sense, like, given its dense atmospheres, grooves, and even the vocal performances on the first track. But it doesn't bother me that much, because at the core, it still feels like King Crimson. You know, King Crimson adapt to this new wave sound very well while adding their progressive twist, and it's only amplified by some infectious guitar lines that are great once again. You know, the excellent tones on those guitars in particular, I just love. There's deep, addicting bass lines that are just so crisp, incredibly dense, and the large synthetic atmospheres are just gorgeous at times. The album finds a really good balance between being calming and serene in its atmospheres, like on Mate Kadase and The Sheltering Sky, and the more explosive like tracks like Elephant Talk and Indiscipline. I think each of the tracks have their own unique aspects that make them great in their own right, but there is at least one pet peeve that I had with the tracks. Like, the spoken word sections in some of the tracks just don't really work for me, and the track Vela Hunjinji in particular is a bit tiresome. But I think that this is the last amazing album that King Crimson did make, however. But besides that, brilliant album. It has some of King Crimson's most creative, interesting, and just amazingly performed tracks in their discography. And I rate it highly because of that.
Yeah, as you mentioned already, Discipline sees King Crimson completely reimagine their style to accompany a lot of new wave elements. They almost even underwent a name change briefly to Discipline, which kind of does, show that this was a completely different era of the band. This isn't really the same band that released, In the Court of the Crimson King and Lark's Tongue and Aspect. The band had already moved to just completely different things and different ideas, and I think this album explores a lot of that new wave sound just really perfectly. And the band, always known for their musicianship and their just technical skill, it's still all evident here. And I do agree, sometimes when I listen to this album, like especially the track Elephant Talk, if I close my eyes, all I see is fucking David Byrne just staring back at me. It definitely does remind me of Talking Heads. But this isn't just like a cheap attempt at doing what was popular. This is genuinely something that the band seemed passionate about, that seemed to be skilled and knowledgeable in, and they pull off one of the best new wave albums of all time here. It definitely still has a lot of prog rock elements. This is definitely still, it still bleeds King Crimson, but it is such a different and such a unique approach that it's really first time going through King Crimson's discography was just earlier this week, and I was just excited at like how different this sounded. It just completely sounded like nothing the band has ever done. There's moments on this album that really have me doing a double take, like, wow, this is really King Crimson. But through and through, it's one of the most technically impressive and just innovative things they've done ever, really.
Dude, whenever I listen to one of the tracks off this thing, all I can hear in the back of my head is, "This is not my beautiful wife."
Yeah, David Byrne dancing, dude.
Yeah, that's all I could just see on my ceiling.
All right. So we've come to a point where I'm going to defend In the Wake of Poseidon. So, like, as much as this thing is derivative of the debut, I don't care. It's those. I'm just gonna start with those interludes, like that little theme they have going on with Peace. Oh, it's just it's so comforting, so beautiful. And Pictures of a City is obviously a bombastic, opener, I'd say, and like it's one of their most off-putting songs because it comes right after like that piece at beginning, which is just like Greg Lake's voice in the background going like, and then Pictures of a City starts and you wake up and you're like, oh, we're here. Oh, okay. And then Cadence and Cascade, I think, is one of their best songs. It really shows their acoustic side very well. I think I like it better if we're going to compare it to Court of the Crimson King. I do like it better than I Talk to the Wind because it's just so... This track is just so uplifting. It's so... it's memorable too. It's just much more memorable too. And like, it's just... Like, that track is just one of my favorite King Crimson songs altogether. And then In the Wake of Poseidon, the title track, holy shit. It's Epitaph on steroids, but, like, still not Epitaph, if you know what I mean. Like, that thing is just, whew. But, and then Cat Food is, like, this jazzy little piano number. And then, The Devil's Triangle, in defense of that track, listening to that in the dark at night is an experience. Like, I did that last night just to see, and, like, I do believe that track is really great, and, like, it creates this really visceral atmosphere. So, this album is amazing.
All right.
Facts.
Okay, my favourite tracks from Discipline are Frame by Frame, Mate Kadasi, and The Sheltering Sky. My least favourite track is Thela Hun Jinjit.
My favourite tracks on Discipline were Elephant Talk, Frame by Frame, Mate Gudasi, Indiscipline, Thela Hun Ginjit, and Discipline. And my least favourite track was The Sheltering Sky. But it was a very tough choice.
Ooh, that's spicy.
My favorite tracks on In the Wake of Poseidon are Cadence and Cascade, In the Wake of Poseidon, and Pictures of a City. And I mean, if I were to pick a least favorite, it's gonna get hard to do that as we go. But if I were to pick a least favorite, it would be the Devil's Triangle.
Fair. We're in the top 3. Oh boy. Oh Christ. This was the toughest ranking I've probably ever had to do in a while.
Yup.
So, for my number 3 pick, I chose Larx's Tongues in Aspic.
I also chose Larx's Tongues in Aspic.
I chose Islands.
Ooh.
Damn.
I love to see the islands praise.
Hell yeah.
Alright, so Larxis is one of the band's most avant-garde and inventive records in their discography, and, you know, as cliche as it is, for the time that it came from, it's just so unique, and even to this day, it's still quite unique and abstract. It's honestly one of the best in the band's discography for that reason alone, but, like, if we're talking about the actual music on this album, holy fucking shit, it is amazing. You know, it's really interesting how the instrumentals on this album are basically the backbone of what would give way and begin a new form of rock in both its mathy time signatures and its very avant-garde and borderline post-rock song structures. They did all this by, you know, dropping all of what they'd done previously and focus more on the bare minimum, but at the same time, it's just so damn intense and experimental. It just works in so many ways. You know, the album is intense with what it does, it's strange in its new direction, and it's just excellent in its sounds. Not to mention, it is heavy as hell, especially in the guitars, as distorted as they are. Some of the most distorted and heaviest tones that Robert Fripp has ever put to tape, I'd say. You know, it's not something that I listen to all that often, which is why it's only at number 3, and it sure as hell isn't the first King Crimson album that I'd probably go to if I'm in the mood for King Crimson, but whenever I listen to it, it's just still really great and enjoyable experience. Many of the tracks on here are just so creative and inventive that it's just hard not to admire what the band did on here, and what each member was able to contribute. I love on that level, like what King Crimson do there, like, you know, as much as they change up their lineup, like, the only consistent member really is Robert Fripp. But, like, I love how each, like, new lineup of the band contributes something totally different to the whole sound. And honestly, I think this is probably one of the best lineups that King Crimson ever had. You know, many of the tracks on here are just so... it's just so good. It's definitely not the best place to start in King Crimson's discography, given how unorthodox of an album it is, but it for sure is an essential moment for the band, and essentially just a great moment for progressive rock in general. And I think it's a good place to start if you want to get into more avant-garde stuff, if you're like kind of knee-deep in just already surface level stuff. But besides that, I think that there's some amazing tracks on here. Like, come on, Exiles is like a top-tier King Crimson song. It's like top 3 for me, honestly. And there's just so many amazing tracks on here. And the talking drum slander will not be tolerated. I do not care.
Yeah, I had the same pick as Mick. 1973 was really a fucking insane year for prog rock.
Literally.
And yeah, Larx's Tongue in Aspic is just one of the few highly influential and just highly groundbreaking albums released in the genre that year. This album just excels at so many things. Just musically, it's so insanely complex and so insanely groundbreaking that, as Trey and you both mentioned, I cannot imagine what it was like hearing this for the first time in 1973. There was nothing like this out. And, you know, every single note here just never feels like it's out of place. It's so just intricately crafted, and it's just so perfectly paced. The moment where the first title track just explodes is just give me such a fucking adrenaline rush. It's one of the highlights of, you know, any album I've heard in recent times. It's just such an incredible album. It's such a polished and refined showcasing of some of the most eclectic yet somehow perfectly and seamlessly put together compositions I've heard ever. It's a highlight in the band's discography. It would be a highlight in any band's discography. and the influence that this album has gone on to, have on so many different things just cannot be understated. It's definitely one of the band's most defining moments, and especially the two different parts of the title track. Both are simply perfect.
Dude, like this alongside Dark Side of the Moon and Selling in England by the Pound is just insane.
Fuck me.
Wow, that was all the same year?
Good.
Yeah, it was all in 1973.
God,
yeah,
early 70s.
Dude, how groundbreaking this album and Dark Side of the Moon in the same year. People were hearing those two albums in the same year. They were probably God. Holy shit, we're living in the future.
I will continue to say that, like, the 70s, and specifically the early 70s, are, like, the best time for music, period. That's my...
Quite possibly, yes.
Yeah. I definitely say, like, the era between, like, the late 60s and the early 70s. That's when I would kind of narrow it down to.
Mm.
Yes. So, number 3, my pick was Islands. This is, as stated before, the most beautiful King Crimson album. So lush. And if you were to attribute a King Crimson album to tasting sweet if you ate it, it would be Islands. That chamber music instrumentation is just lovely. And I'll usually go for a more relaxing side of music more than like harsh stuff. So that's why this is above Larks' Tongues in aspect. But man, Islands, the track list is so solid. It's super consistent. And like there isn't a lull on this thing at all. Like it just keeps pelting you with like different energies. Like there's the Sailor's Tale, which is probably the most in-your-face track out of the entire album, if we're talking like from an instrumental standpoint. The jazziest one. But then you got things like Prelude, Song of the Gulls, which is like, what? Whoever composed that, I didn't research, but whoever composed that, they need props. That thing is so beautiful. And then the title track, Islands, is, I think, my favorite King Crimson song. Like, definitely. And, yeah, that's why Islands is so high for me. I love this thing.
Love to hear it. Love to hear it.
Hell yeah.
All right. My favorite tracks from Larks' Tongues and Aspic are both the title tracks, Exiles, The Talking Drum, and Easy Money. If I had to pick a least favorite, I'd probably say Book of Saturday.
This is where I start doing this. My favorite tracks were all of them. My least favorite tracks were none of them.
Oh, we can do that? Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can.
Well, for Islands, if I were to pick a least favorite, it would be Sailor's Tale, but all of them are like my favorites.
Yes. And we're in the top 2.
Okay, now if you guys say... Oh, God, okay. Let's go.
We all have the same albums. Oh, shit.
Oh, God.
Fucking hell, this was so tough.
Yeah.
My number 2 pick is Red.
And my number 2 pick is also Red.
My number 2 pick is In the Court of the Crimson King.
Yeah, no
To be
one's
fair,
offended, let's be honest.
I can't be mad at that. They're both amazing albums. Like, in general, like... So yeah, we'll just get right into it. Red. Red is fucking awesome. What more needs to be said? It's a near-perfect album that has 5 tracks of pure experimental prog fuckage. And I fucking love the shit out of it.
Well, we pulled out that new vocabulary.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah. Quote me on that.
Pitchfork won't be using that.
You know, this album's 5 tracks deliver on just being an incredible journey through a prog masterclass of like well-constructed and intricate song structures with incredible instrumentals and musicianship. You know, some of the band's best instrumentation and production is on this album. The guitar and bass tones sound amazing on this album. On the heavier cuts especially, they sound so grimy. The drumming is so precise and energetic. The serene and atmospheric tracks are just gorgeous. And the sound is just so raw and unrelenting, and I just love it. Some of Robert Fripp's most memorable riffs are on this album too. Some of the hardest hitting songs in King Crimson's discography are on this album in tracks like Red, One More Red Nightmare, and Starless. The improv is just excellent on these tracks. There's excellent moments of lyricism too, like on Fallen Angel, and there's just so many glorious moments to be found throughout this album, and I love them to death. You know, Red is just absolutely incredible. It's even hard. It's just so hard for me even to talk about this right now because like it's just so beyond my comprehension, honestly. But at the same time, it's just such a defining moment for King Crimson. It's such a influential piece, and as a whole, it's easily one of their best albums. But there is one that I do prefer. So yeah, it was a tough decision, but yeah, Red at number 2.
Yeah, well, very tough decision, but you know, this album, Red is so damn good in pretty much every single aspect. It's really quite overwhelming to try and break down this album and talk about it. Everything it does instrumentally is just completely flawless. Every time I listen to this project, I just get completely mesmerized by how every single little note, every bass line, every drum fill, every vocal passage, they all just are so perfectly and seamlessly and effortlessly weaved together. And the most confusing thing about this album is just how effortless it sounds. It has some of the most complex and some of the most groundbreaking and inventive musical compositions I've ever heard, but it's all so natural and seamless and perfect. It's just such a massive album, just when it comes to sheer just grandiosity and just it's just like a wall of absolute prog. Just I can't even explain. It's just genius.
Fuckage.
It's complete. It's fuckage, dude. It's absolute fuckage. It's genius. It's every single second of this album is just mesmerizing. It's so perfect. Every track on here is a highlight in the band's discography, and you know, every single second of every track is a highlight in the band's discography. It's all just completely impressive, completely memorable, and it's really easy to see why this is regarded as one of the best albums of all time. And you know, this album's nothing short of spectacular. I don't have much more to say. Absolute fuckage.
Couldn't agree more. So my number 2 spot, what more can I say about this thing that hasn't already been said? In the Court of the Crimson King is quite possibly one of the greatest albums of all time ever made. This thing, beautiful, perfect. Yep, it exists, and it's track after track. Like I feel like I would be doing this album a disservice if I talked about it like, oh, this thing is good. No, this thing transcends music, and I stand behind that wholeheartedly. Like, it makes it. This is the album where I would say, like, imagine hearing this from a debut in 1969. Like, what are you doing? Like, oh, it's so atmospheric, and like, it's so nostalgic too. Greg Lake continues to be one of my favorite vocalists ever, even when he went and left the band and went to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Like, his vocals are just absolutely spectacular, and yeah, to keep it short, In the Court of the Crimson King is an essential in any music listener's catalog.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
My favourite tracks from Red are Starless, Red, One More Red Nightmare, and Fallen Angel. I have no least favourite tracks.
Yeah, all of them are my favorite. None of them are my least favorite. I'm not going to waste time.
In the Court of the Crimson King, all of them are my favorite, except for the back half of Moonchild, which, if it had a little more going on, it would be higher in the ranking. It would be number 1. But yeah, that's the only thing holding it back.
I fuck with that part.
So do I.
I know it is a talking point, though.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people like get put off by like that side of Moonchild, but honestly, I love it. I can't get enough of it, and that's why it's one of my favorite tracks on In the Court of the Crimson King. And speaking of In the Court of the Crimson King, that's my number 1 pick, In the Court of the Crimson King.
Yeah, surprise if you narrow it down, you know it's also my number 1.
And then my number 1 is Red.
Yeah, and I cannot blame you for that. Both amazing albums.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Ah, yes. In the Court of the Crimson King. Well and truly a masterpiece of rock and all music in general. It's just such an amazing album for its time, and truly a crowning achievement in progressive music. I've never really had like a favorite albums of all time list, or even have a definitive like favorite album of all time. But the more that I've thought about it, honestly, if I were to make one soon enough, In the Court of the Crimson King would probably be that. It would probably be my favorite album of all time.
Wow.
And for a good reason. This album is
Wow.
legitimately perfect, and it just struck me since the first time I ever listened to it. I think that it's insane that this album came out in 1969. Like, that's just insane to me. Like, especially with how it sounds, given how crisp it sounds, how technical the performances are, how large the sound is. Like, if you were like to ask me when this came out without me even knowing the date, I would have guessed it maybe came out in like the late 70s or something, but 1969. Jesus Christ, man. And like, people were truly blown away by it. Like, if you've ever seen like that, like documentaries about them, like that there was like a show they did opening for the Rolling Stones, and like,
Oh, at Hyde Park.
at Hyde Park, and like, people didn't know what the fuck they were listening to, but like, it was truly something else. This was inventive as fuck. Like, you know, this 5-track masterpiece contains like some of the most beautiful sounding, well produced, diverse, just sort of best prog material ever made. And I feel like there's few projects that can really live up to the caliber of what was presented on In the Court of the Crimson King. This album takes influences from, you know, plenty of styles and sounds, all while being very well structured in terms of its compositions, and we hear influences just from rock, jazz, classical, and psychedelia primarily, all of which coincide incredibly well and very effortlessly. Like, everything on here just seems so effortless, yet it's so interconnected and it works so well. You know, this album, like, instrumentally, everyone is on point. Like, you cannot fuck with anything that is on this in terms of like technical prowess, because it is insane. You know, the drumming was amazing. I love the mellotron. Like, Michael Giles is just fucking brilliant on drums. The speedy prowess to his light tapping is just incredible, and the mellotron on this just creates such a dreamlike and almost ethereal soundscape, and it's so immaculate. Like, the album finds a great amount of variety in tones and moods of tracks, while being very explosive and virtuosic, like on 21st Century Schizoid Man, and gorgeous, like on I Talk to the Wind and Moonchild. And Epitaph and the title track are just transcendental bangers. They are incredible. Not to mention, these are just some of the best songs like ever made, in my opinion. I love how alluring and often outspoken the songwriting is too, like on Epitaph and 21st Century Schizoid Man, which tackled themes like corruption, war, loss, and it's all written with such an emotive quality, and it's only added on to by Greg Lake's vocals, which on here are just so, they just have so much emotional weight to them, and he's my favorite vocalist that King Crimson ever had, and it's like, it's a shame that he didn't stick around after that. But, you know, I digress. As a whole, yeah, in the Court of the Crimson King is okay. It's nothing remarkable.
Yeah. Easily album, yeah.
Also, actually, this is something I forgot to mention though. I broke my drumsticks last night, and I was buying some on Amazon as well. And I was buying new drumsticks on Amazon, but while I was doing that, I was also listening to In the Court of the Crimson King again. But then I just decided out in order to buy In the Court of the Crimson King on vinyl, so it's coming here soon. And the best part about it is I timed it to like the explosive bit on the title track so perfectly, and it just felt gratifying to do that.
Hell
no,
yeah.
you need that album on vinyl. You really do.
I wanna have it like facing like.
I have a wee display. I never put that album up because it scares me when I wake up at night. That's not.
I'm putting that facing towards me every time I wake up every morning.
No,
I don't care.
do it. Don't do it.
Good
Do not
morning.
do it.
I'm gonna do it.
It's not fun. Yeah, no. I wouldn't call it my favorite album of all time. I cannot do that to Loveless. But it's definitely top 10, top 5 even. It's just one of the most incredible and mind-blowing pieces of music ever created. And just as you said, 1969. That is unbelievable. It even though I know it was released in 1969, I've known this fact for many years, I still don't believe it. I refuse to fucking believe it. There is some sort of glitch in the fucking time-space continuum. This was not released in 1969. Everything is a lie. It was released just before the big prog boom in the 70s, and it all kind of acts as a touchstone, and it acts as a touchstone for every single prog act to try and follow, and for good reason. It's completely flawless. It's a mesmerizing album from start to finish, and the 5 tracks it presents are each some of the greatest musical compositions ever performed, and not only in the world of prog but just in the world of music at large. It has such an eclectic yet calculated sound palette. Each track just sounds completely unique and just thoroughly memorable. Every single little passage, every single little drum fill is just so unbelievably memorable and timeless. This album is just a compilation of just iconic passage after iconic passage. It never feels sloppy, it never feels disjointed. Everything flows seamlessly together, and the jazz infused instrumentation that this album brought is just really unlike anything that was present at the time, and still nothing really lives up to what King Crimson did here. It's one of the greatest pieces of music ever made, just through and through. And as a drummer, I have to add that 21st Century Schizoid Man is definitely my favorite drum track of all time. Michael Giles is a fucking machine. He is a fucking monster.
Yes.
He is so precise but so groovy and so quick. It just makes it doesn't compute.
Underrated drummer.
Most underrated
Literally.
drummer of all time, in my opinion.
I agree. I'd honestly, just for that alone, I'd probably put him in my top 10. Or even top 5.
Honestly, yeah. That track alone. Like, there's just so much. I can't even. I'm done. Also, I know that
Go.
similar. Stephen Morris from Joy Division was also a fucking underrated drummer. He's literally a fucking human drum machine.
I fucking agree heavy.
Well, that leaves me talking about Red, which is, if I were to explain like how this album broke me when I first listened to it, TLDR, like really short version, I have chromesthesia, which is where I can like hear colors when I listen to music, and this entire thing is fucking red, and it broke me. I was like, do you have it too? Like, I was like asking myself, like, do these guys have it? Because like, I know it's different for everybody, but like, what the fuck? And it sent me spiraling. Like, Red absolutely destroyed me. It's what, like, when people talk about one of the some of the greatest music ever made and ever recorded and ever put in an album, I have to mention Red, because it's just it's timeless, it's ahead of its time, and timeless. And I think Starless is like literally one of the greatest songs ever written. Like, Starless is, oh my god, that beginning part where it's all slow and jazzy and like you're in like a lounge, and then it gets all like that build up. Oh my god, that crescendo. And then I'd say the last, I think, 2 minutes of the song with like the main riff just blaring on the sax is just some of the best one of the best things that just exist. Like, oh, I can't talk about this record enough. So to quell my rambling, I'll stop there. But yeah, Red, absolute masterpiece.
I agree. And we did it. We ranked every King Crimson album, and that was fun. Thanks for coming on, Trey. We really appreciate it.
Oh no, thank you guys for having me. This is one of my favorite bands.
Peace and love.
Peace and love.
Yeah, and you know what? Just to announce it now, you'll be back soon anyway, because I'm going to announce what we're going to be doing for the next 2 podcasts. Next week's Worst to Best, we're going to be doing one on Daft Punk, and...
Shout out to their family.
Oh god, no. Do not remind me that David Guetta exists, please. And the week after, Trey will be returning for a Bjork Worst to Best.
Woo! The queen herself.
Which I'm excited for in particular, because I've been meaning to listen to Bjork.
We really wanted to get Louis on that episode because he fucking hates Bjork for some reason, and we think.
Oh my god, you totally should.
Yeah, but I don't think he will.
Don't
listen
get him
to every
on.
album.
Don't get him on. No, it'll be a nightmare.
I don't think he listened. I do not think he listened to any of them.
I doubt he will. I doubt he will. He's too busy listening to Audio Slave.
Yeah. And Korn.
And Pearl Jam.
Yeah,
I mean, Pearl Jam's not
Pearl
too
Jam
bad, but
fucking slaps.
I mean, some tracks slap. I haven't heard everything, but some
No.
tracks slap.
Listen to their first few albums, man. Shit
Okay,
slaps.
fair. Okay.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Trey.
Thank you, Trey. Thank you so much. And
Thank you,
with
guys.
that in mind, thanks for checking out today's episode of the Tape Podcast. We hope that you enjoyed. Necessary links will be in the description to me and Nostalgia's Album of the Years, all of our Rate Your Music pages, and all of our own individual YouTube channels. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I'm Nostalgia.
I'm Trey.
And see ya!
Peace.
See you guys.
Fuckage.
Fuck it, dude. Yeah.